welcome to another session of Paper and Paint. This is an online program provided by Garden City Arts, and my name is Katie Guthrie. I'm going to be walking you through this process tonight. So far in this series, we have been focusing on printmaking and basically decorating our papers. So, you may recall our jelly plate monotype prints that we made, and our paper marbling prints that we made. We're going to take all of these decorative papers that we worked really hard on, and we're going to cut them up and turn them into different art projects. So this week we're focusing on bookmaking. Next week we'll worry about collage. So bookmaking is one of my favorite forms of creating. I could nerd out and geek out about this all day. I'm going to try to keep it short and not go into too many details, but just know bookmaking is so much fun. Hopefully when things resume and we can continue our in-person classes, we can have another bookmaking workshop because we haven't had one for a while and I miss it. So today we are focusing on a very simple form of bookmaking. It is the simplest and it's called the pamphlet stitch. So I'm going to hold this up for you to see, and you can see the spine is literally just, well, in this case, chipboard folded in half. So the spine is where the crease is. And the spine is basically the part of the book that allows it to open. It's also where pages are sewn into it. So important part of the book. And in this case, it is a very thin spine. Now, again, this is the most simplified version of bookmaking. However, there are more complex, way more complex. So I have a few examples for you. Here is a continuous covered book, and you can see the spine is much thicker. It allows for a lot more pages inside. It is a really fun one. This one is called the snowshoe stitch. It's a very complex form of bookbinding. And then we also have some really fun ones. These are Japanese stat bindings. Now these are a little bit different. They're open spine bindings, so they're not continuous covers like this. This is a really interesting form of art. You get to stab it a whole bunch, so it helps take out some aggression and frustration. It's good for these times. So you can look into that if you really enjoy bookmaking. You can look into like what that involves. You can see two different variations of this form of bookmaking. One is just the basic form, the one on top, and the one on bottom is a variation. It is called the hemp leaf stitch. So here are some different types of books. Now, even though I'm showing you a simple one, I want to talk about how you can grow and build your bookmaking knowledge, starting off on a simple note. This pamphlet stitch, you can use it to combine it into other forms of bookmaking. One form of bookmaking is called the accordion book. I bet you can't tell why it's called the accordion book. So this book is basically just a continuous piece of paper folded back and forth, and then hard covers on the outer edges. I used a pamphlet stitch to sew in sections in between each one of those folds so that you have pockets. Ooh, I'm holding it upside down. You have pockets and various pieces of paper in between, and the cool thing about this book is you can flip it back and forth. It's really fun. So again, if you enjoy this, you can research and like learn how to do some other various forms of bookmaking. This is actually a variation on the pamphlet stitch. This is a variation I came up with. You can come up with a whole bunch on your own. You can even look up other people's variations. It's really fun. So now that you have some ideas of bookmaking and what all you can do with it, let's talk about the supplies you'll need really fast, and then we'll get started. So to make one of these books right here, you will need thread. Now, thread, I should say string probably. Thread that you sew with is usually just like 1 or 2 plies of really thin material. This is much thicker, okay? It's probably 4 plies of thread twisted together. So you'll want some thicker thread or string. You'll want a butter knife. I know it sounds weird. It'll make sense in a second. And And you'll want a pair of scissors, of course, and a mechanical pencil. Not just for writing. You also want a ruler. I just forgot. I don't have that on hand, but you want a ruler. Not just for writing do you need this tool, but also because we're going to use it to punch holes into our paper to sew. Now, traditional bookmakers have their own tools, like awls to punch holes, but I'm guessing that's probably not a tool that you have at your home, so we're using alternatives. You'll also want to have some copy paper on hand. This is important. This is basically what's going to be inside your book. You can choose what you put inside your book, of course. And then you'll want to have some thicker material for the cover. It can be chipboard, that is harder to work with, FYI, or it can be heavier duty like paper, like watercolor paper. That's what this one is. Okay, it's a lot thicker. Or mixed media material, paper, cardstock, what have you. Any of that stuff will work. So we know what we're doing. We know what we need supplies-wise. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so really fast. I forgot to mention a few things that we will need for this project just a minute ago. We're gonna need some kind of glue. It can be a simple glue stick. It can be Mod Podge, whatever that you can brush on, whatever you want, but you will probably need glue. I'll show you a version where you won't need it and a version where you can use it. You'll also need some kind of old book, like a phone book or something like that, that you can open up and lay flat. That's gonna act as our cradle to punch holes into the paper so that the holes remain straight. So, with those two things said, let's go ahead and get started. We are going to work on the cover first of our book. So the cover is the outside part. It's the protective part of the book that keeps the pages nice and clean and straight. So when you make a cover, sometimes, not all the time, it's up to you, you can leave a gutter around the book guts. It's literally what it's called. So the section or the pages of your book, the book guts, you can leave a gutter around the book guts and the cover of your book. Okay, it's up to you. If you don't want to, you don't have to. I'm going to show you both ways. So I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to show you the non-glue version of my book really fast, of this project. I'm going to take this paper because it is I printed on nice thick cardstock. And the very first thing I'm going to do is literally just fold it in half. And by doing that, it's going to become my cover. Now, when you fold things in half, you want to lay it so that the paper is longest if you are folding like a traditional book. And you take the top and bring it down to the bottom. You match corner to corner, and you'll want to hold with one hand so that it doesn't move around on you, and then you use your other hand, your finger specifically, to kind of go and crush the wave, and then you crease it on either side. Usually you have a bone folder that you would use for this, for traditional bookmaking. If you don't have a bone folder, which you probably don't, you can take your ruler and use that, okay? And that'll make a nice crisp crease. The more crisp the crease, the better your book will be at staying shut. If you don't really get a good fold, then it's not going to stay open, okay? So really crease that fold and it'll be nice and ready to go. So this is the glue-free version. It's going to be a smaller book since my cover is going to be smaller. And once I have my cover done, that's literally all you do with the cover, especially with the glueless version because we're not gluing anything onto it, we're not adding. You want to take your paper and you want to fold it down to size. So this is where the butter knife comes in because we're going to be doing some cutting and we're going to use the butter knife. Bless me, sorry. Excuse me. So I'm going to fold and crease this paper. I already know that I used cardstock that I cut in half and it was the standard size paper. So I know that I could do the exact same thing with this paper, and I will have perfectly sized paper that will line up with my cover. I could cut it down smaller if I wanted to, especially if you have a paper cutter at home. It makes life easier. If you don't, you might want to just say, who cares? So my butter knife, I'm going to slide it in between the folds, so basically where the paper opens up, and I'm going to make this little circular motion. Okay, this little circular motion, believe it or not, will cut the paper. The smaller the circles, the cleaner the cuts will be, and the easier it might be for you. Now, if you've done this a million times like me, then you can do it really fast. It might take a little bit of practice, no worries if your first attempts don't go well. The reason I like to use the butter knife for the paper is, do you see how it kind of gives like a fun tear to it? Every butter knife's different. I found one butter knife, and I'm sad to say I lost it. It made little paper curls so that the edges were really cool. You can do whatever you want. I like to alternate so that there's one clean side, one kind of torn, tattered side. Now, I did that to 2 pages at once, so I now have 4 pages. Now, when it's a regular page, you can't use it for your book. You have to fold it and crease it to create a sew line in order for it to become a part of your book. Now, when you crease a paper and fold it in half, that it becomes now a folio. One folio by itself, one piece of paper by itself is just a folio. When you have, let me do this super fast, 1 or more folios that are sandwiched in between each other, kind of like an alligator eating another alligator, it becomes a section. So 2 or more folios make up a section. Our books only have 1 section, but larger books, like I showed you just a second ago, can have tons of sections. So I'm just going to stick with 4 folios. My book's going to be nice and simple. So my section has 4 folios. It's ready to go. All you have to do, if you want to keep it the same size, and if you don't care about having a gutter to protect the paper inside, the book guts, all you have to do is, once again, alligator eat your pages, and you have your book. So this is the simplest form, no glue, no cutting or measuring or any of that stuff. This is the nice and simple route. If you want to do that, perfect. If you want something more complex, you can take heavier paper and use that for your cover. You can take thinner paper and put that inside. What you will need to do is measure. I'm going to use this example because it's easier to see the contrast from the cover and the section. You are going to cut your paper inside down by a quarter of an inch before you fold it into folios, okay? So your long pieces of paper, before you turn them into folios by folding them in half, you are going to measure your cover. Say your cover is 4 inches by 8 inches, just a random idea. Then you are going to cut your paper down to 3 3/4 inch going up and down, and 7 7/4 inch going side to side, okay? That is if you want a gutter. So basically we're making the inside of our book smaller than the outside of our book in very simple terms. I'll let you decide if you want to do that. I have already made my version of that before I started filming, so that one is done. I'm going to walk you through how to make your book now. After we've made our book, regardless of whether you plan on gluing different things, prints and stuff like that, to your paper, you are going to make your book first, then we can glue afterwards, okay? So we'll do that in a second. So, regardless of whether you're going the non-glue method or the glue method, you are still going to make your book now, and we're going to walk you through right now. So, I'm going to grab my mechanical pencil and my giant book that I can open up flat and lay down, and I'm going to punch holes into the cover. Now, my suggestion would be that you come up with a plan first. So maybe you make an extra folio. So now my poor book is going to be really small. It is only going to have 3 folios. So I'm going to take an extra folio and I'm going to make a template. A template is basically your plan of where you're going to punch holes. So you're going to measure how long the spine of your folio, basically where the crease is, and you're going to put 5 marks equally spaced along your template. Now, it really doesn't matter where you put them. They don't have to be equally spaced. They could be random. It's up to you. The only thing is that that hole cannot be 1/4 of an inch close to the top or the bottom. So in book terms, this is the thumb edge where it opens up. This is the spine. This is the top of the book, and this is the bottom, head and tail, okay? Those are the proper terms. So when you're making your template, your holes cannot be 1/4 of an inch closer to the head or the tail. It has to be 1/4 of an inch away or more. It could be bigger. That's absolutely fine. So I'm going to do a 1/2 inch just to be safe. The reason for that is that you don't want to punch through the top of your book and then you don't have any way of like properly sewing it in. So there's 2 marks. I'm going to do 1 inch. And then, so I have 4 marks, and then I'm going to take 2.5 and I'm going to, let's see, divide it in half. So that would be 1 1/4, and that would be the center. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Another thing you want to do when you're making a template is I always put an arrow so that you know which is the top and which is the bottom, or meant to be. And then I always write template so that I know, and I can keep these and I can use them for later. So I have my template now made. I'm going to take one piece of paper, one folio at a time. I lay it into the spine of my book, the opening, and you want to make sure that it's nice and flush, the top and the bottom. And then you're going to take your pencil. If you have an awl, seriously, it's so much easier. And you are going to punch. Oh no, my mechanical pencil all of a sudden stopped working. Well, you have the idea of it. You could use a pen, you can use whatever. As long as it's a sharp, pointy object, you can use it. I'll be right back. I'm going to go grab my actual awl. I just realized technically you could use a needle because you're going to need one of those too. That's another thing I forgot to list on the supplies list. Sorry. Okay, so we're going to punch our holes. You need to be able to see through them, and they need to be big enough that you can get a needle through it, but you don't want it super big. If it's super big, then your book is going to have really loose binding, which is not a good thing. So once I do that once with my template, I am a sloppy bookmaker. I've picked up bad habits over the years, and I just use my first one to punch all of them. You can choose to be a better bookmaker if you want to. I'm just going to go fast and do it. And then you'll want to punch through the cover. Okay, so you should have 5 holes punched in your section and your cover, and now you are ready to sew. So, kudos, good job. Now, either way, glueless or glued version, you are going to do this step. You're going to punch your holes. We're going to sew it next, and then we'll talk about how, if you didn't pick the glueless version, you want to decorate your cover, you can. All right, so let's grab a needle and thread and we will get started in just a second. Okay, now that we are moving on to the sewing part of our book, you can clean up your space, kind of get rid of everything. We don't need anything except for the needle and the thread, and of course, your book that we're sewing. Now, really fast, let's measure out our thread and cut it. So you need 3 times the length of the spine. And we're measuring the spine from the top or the head of the book to the bottom or the tail, okay? So I measure generously always, that way you don't run out of thread. So I'm gonna measure 1 length, 2 lengths, and 3, and then I'm done. Now, before we start sewing, let's talk about the thread. Again, it needs to be pretty thick. Traditional books actually used waxed linen thread. I use waxed Irish linen thread because it is the best and I love it. The wax helps the thread from getting tangled. When you're doing more complex sewings of books, it really does help. And the linen thread is archival, which means it doesn't break down or degrade. It's not acidic, so it will last longer. So just keep that in mind if you do want to do bookmaking or explore it more. Waxed linen thread is the material to get. We're just using regular thread because the theme during this quarantine is whatever works. So you want to take your thread your needle. I use tapestry needles because they have bigger eyes on the needle, so it's easier to use thicker thread. Okay. Also, usually tapestry needles are dull, so you won't stab yourself. Kind of helps. Once you have that, you can leave a little bit of a tail. Now, I'm sure if you have any experience sewing, you've probably had the unfortunate experience of pulling your thread out as you pull on your needle. We're going to make a bookmaker's knot that will prevent that. Your thread has multiple plies, multiple strands of string kind of woven together. You are going to take on the tail side of your needle, you are going to hold it and you are going to stab your needle in between some of those plies. Do you see that? Okay, that's all you do. That's it. And then you send your needle through and it makes what I call the bookmaker's knot. So it stops it from pulling through. It just basically grabs it and you will not lose your needle. It's really handy. You can do this with thicker thread. I've never done this with thinner thread sewing. It probably won't work. So just heads up. Bookmaker's knot. If you don't know how to do that, if you couldn't see it in the video, no stress. It's not going to affect your book. It's just more of a convenience note. So we have our needle threaded. I have a little diagram here for you, and I'm basically just going to walk you through where we are. That way, hopefully we won't get lost and this will be a super easy project. FYI, the pamphlet stitch, I have taught to kindergartners before, and so it is really, really easy, no stress. The whole goal for the pamphlet stitch is to begin and end in the same hole, which is going to be the middle hole, okay? So if there's 2 holes above it and 2 holes below it, as you can see on my diagram. And it's also the goal is to not have 2 pieces of thread going in between the same hole. So as we sew this, it is going to perfectly be sewn so that there's only 1 single piece of thread in between each hole on both the outside and the inside cover. It's really a cool stitch. So I'm going to take my needle and I am going to start in the valley of my book, so the inside, not the outside where the cover is. Do you see how the outside looks like a mountain? The inside looks like a valley, okay? We're starting on the inside, the valley, in the center hole, and I am going to bring my thread through till there is just a little bit of a tail, and then I'm holding one thumb inside my book, holding it onto the tail so that I can't pull all the way through, and then I have the rest of my fingers holding the outside of the book. Keep a hold of it like this for now. Even if it's inconvenient, it will help you control your sewing. So you can see we're in the middle hole, so we are perfectly centered between the top and the bottom of our book. Now, we're going to go to the mountain, and we're going to go up 1 hole, and we're going to go from the outside to the inside. Now, sometimes this can be difficult. If you find that you don't get through the cover and the section at the same time, what I suggest for people to do is to take your needle and wiggle it just a little bit. It makes your hole a little bit bigger and it lines it up so that it's easier to go through perfectly and all at the same time, and you don't have to move your hand. So I'm on the inside of my book on the second from the top hole, okay? Once you're there, we're gonna go up one more hole. Now we're on the inside, so we're gonna start on the inside and we're gonna go to the outside, to the mountain. Now we're on the top hole on the outside of our book. We've reached the top. We're gonna work our way down here from now on out, from here on out, blah, blah, blah. So we're on the outside. We're gonna go through a hole that we've already been through. So we're gonna go down one hole. Now, you might be like, oh, I got this. I don't have to watch her anymore. I'm going to throw a curveball at you here in a second, so pay attention. So we're going to go down one hole, and we're going from the outside to the inside cover. Make sure that you are pulling tight. At this point, you can release the tail, and you'll have more movement of your left hand because we have several stitches, so it's nice and tight, and you won't pull through your thread. Okay, now, we want to end on the center hole. So we are not going back through it at this time. We're going to end on it. So we're going to skip that center hole and we're going to go down to a hole that we have not been through yet. And we're heading to the tail or the bottom of our book. We're going from the valley of our book to the peak. Okay? And we are on the second from the bottom hole. Now, once you're there, you are going to go from the peak to the valley of your book. If you need to, if you ever find that you can't get through the hole, use your table to like push or punch the needle through. It works really well. And we're gonna go through that last hole that we haven't been through at the very bottom of our book. So we went from the mountain to the valley. You will probably notice that there are empty spots on your book. We're gonna work our way back up to that center hole now. So we're at the very bottom hole and we're in the valley of the book. We're gonna go up back to that top hole and we're gonna work our way back to the center. We're going from the valley to the peak. And then once you're there, you're on the peak, on the second from the bottom hole. You're gonna go back through that middle hole and that's where we're ending. We're almost done. I'm gonna pull my needle through and now we need to tie off. So you'll see there's this long strand right here in the middle. I like to put one thread on either side of that strand. I pull tight, not too tight, you don't want to rip your paper, and then I do a knot. Just a simple over and under knot, and then I do it again for the second time. Now, you have all this extra thread. You might be tempted to cut it off right by the knot. Don't do that. Leave about 1/4 of an inch of tail above the knot. That way, your knot doesn't pull out. So, that is how you sew your book. It is literally that simple. After you're done sewing, you'll notice that your book cover probably will want to come open again. What you can do is crease it. Also, after I've sewn a book that doesn't want to stay closed, I just sandwich it in between two heavy books and leave it overnight, and then it'll be just fine. So we have one book made. This is the glueless version. If you would prefer, I'm not going to sew this again. You can just rewind the video if you want, but I'm going to show you what you can do if you want to add glue or glued components to your book. So I've already sewn this book. It has a watercolor paper cover and then paper inside. It has a gutter like we talked about, so I cut the pages down to size. So you can see two very different pamphlet stitch versions of this book. Two very different versions of this pamphlet stitch book. Blah, blah, blah. There we go. Okay, so now we have to decide. You can pick one of your papers, maybe cut it down to fit your cover. and you know, find your favorite part of your print. When you do that, you do not want to have anything going off of the edge of your book, the thumb edge or the head or the tail of your book. If you do, you need to wrap it around to the inside. You could cut it off there, but what happens is it has a tendency to fray if it runs too close to the cover. So I like to leave kind of a little gutter around the outside. It just not only looks nicer, but it'll also last longer than if you put it right against the edge of the book. Again, if you run off, so let's say this is the design of your paper, and you run off, then you would have to fold it, crease it, and wrap it around and glue it onto the inside of your book. That's what I was trying to say. So, let's grab some decorative paper really fast. I'm going to use this piece, and you're going to have to do a little bit of measuring. I made this book 8 1/4 tall and about 5 inches wide. So I know that I will need to cut this design down and make it smaller. So if you don't have a paper cutters would make this process so much easier. But if you don't have a paper cutter, you can do it kind of the old-fashioned way, where you start by just making a line, and then you can take your butter knife and cut it. And, oh, I might not like that edge. I might choose a different edge. I might choose this edge. It's a bit cleaner. Now, this first line does not have to be squared, because this is the line that we will build off of. All other lines will need to be squared. So if you have a mat like I'm working on, it will be a lot easier. Or you could take a book as a reference. Those are usually pretty squared. So I know that I want to cut this and make it nice and square. Okay. And then I know that I need to cut this down and make it smaller than 5. So I'm going to cut it down to, let me see, I have 7 1/4. So I'm going to cut it down an inch smaller than 5, because a 7 1/4 is an inch smaller than 8. That way it's nice and even. So I'm going to cut this down to 4, which just happens to be right there on my little mat. That's why these mats are so awesome. You can just use the lines and make sure everything's nice and square. Okay, this isn't super square, but I'm going to pretend like it is because it's a demo, so, you know, demos never turn out quite that well for me. Okay. So, then I want 7 1/4, which I already know is about right there. I'm going to just guesstimate and fold using an edge to make sure it's nice and squared and flush. Oops. If you need to, you can always take piece of your scissors and cut off a piece of paper. It's being a jerk. Okay, and then I would just glue that into the center of my watercolor book that's plain. And again, you can use a glue stick or you can use Mod Podge to glue it down. It's up to you. So, remember, you don't have to do anything this simple. You could collage onto it, you know, grab a whole bunch of different scraps, whatever you want. We'll talk more about collage next week. Really, it's up to you what you want to do. You can keep it simple or do something more complex that's really fun. Either way, I hope you have a blast. I hope you learned a lot about bookmaking, and I hope that you get the bookmaking bug like I have, and you decide to research and maybe continue pursuing that. So, have a good rest of your week. I'll see you next week for collage.